Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to Face to Face. I'm your host, Dennis Ward. Our guest this week is Daryl LaRue. Daryl is a professor in the Department of Social Justice and Community Studies at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Daryl teaches courses in critical race theory, studies on colonialism, multiculturalism, and diversity, among other things. Some of his work has been related to the self-made Métis, and Daryl, we appreciate you taking some time to be with us here today and welcome you to Face to Face.
Thanks.
You've written about the meteoric rise in the number of people self-identifying as Métis that's been going on since the early 2000s. What kind of numbers are we talking about?
The numbers are quite significant. For instance, if we look at Nova Scotia as an example, if we're looking at the census in particular, the increase in the number of individuals who are self-identifying as Métis in Nova Scotia has gone from 830 in 1996 to 23,315 in 2016. And I expect that number will increase even more, given that this movement is sort of just developing right now, this, particularly in Nova Scotia, this Acadian Métis movement. In Quebec, we see similar numbers, not quite as steep a climb in that period of time. In this case, we're talking about 20 years in the Maritimes in Nova Scotia. In Quebec, it's really since 2001, so it's a little bit, since about 2003, I should say. So it shows up in the 2006 census. And the increase has been from about 15,000 in Quebec, people who are identifying as Métis, to about 70,000 in 2016, so 4 times.
What is it about that time period that we started seeing these increases?
Well, there are 2 things. I think what happens, and this is in discussing this issue with Mi'kmaq people in particular in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, what we see is that with the Marshall decision, the Supreme Court Marshall decision in 1999, which is a decision that confirms that the Mi'kmaq have a right to make moderate livelihood in the fisheries. And you may remember Alanis Omasmawan's film Is the Crown at War with Us, which documented the really extreme violence and efforts to stop the Mi'kmaq from going on the water to assert those rights. What happens is many of the Acadians, who are living oftentimes side by side with a number of Mi'kmaq communities, start seeing this as an opportunity to claim Aboriginal rights. So they see that the Mi'kmaq, there's this decision that confirms that the Mi'kmaq have fishing rights, and so we see this move where Acadians start to build this idea that there's an Acadian Métis people with actual Section 35 Aboriginal rights. So that happens a little bit before it does in Quebec and Quebec and Ontario. The real sort of linchpin, I think, of the movement is the Powley decision, the Supreme Court Powley decision, which affirmed Métis Aboriginal rights in 2003, but also set out a test, a 10-part, it's called the Powley test, for individuals who might be claiming Aboriginal rights, so whether or not they're Métis. And the test and the decision itself, in a way, widens the definition of who may be Métis, but doesn't widen it enough to include these so-called Eastern Métis organizations and individuals. Because so far, there have been 18 different court cases that have made it to provincial courts in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Quebec, and they've all lost. So they've all failed to actually meet the Powley test. 3 of them went to the Court of Appeal, 1 in Quebec, that just happened this past year in July, and then 2 in New Brunswick. So when I say 18, it's 15 different cases, 3 that made it to the appeals case, the appeals level.
Right.
So what the Powley case does, though, is it provides sort of an opportunity for, in this case, I call them French descendants. And by that I mean people like myself who are related to the first French settlers, either in Acadia or parts of Nova Scotia, or in the rest of New France, particularly the Laurentian Valley in what is called Quebec today. So when I talk about French descendants, what happens is the Powley decision kind of seems to open a door for people with long ago ancestry to claim a Métis identity. And that's what we see happening in Quebec, in parts of eastern Ontario, for instance, where there are lots of French descendants, in New Brunswick, where it's primarily Acadians, and in Nova Scotia.
So is it hunting and fishing rights really what's behind the drive here?
My research into the formation of specific organizations, so after the Pali decision, it's not just that individuals are making these claims, it's that there's all these new organizations that are formed. So right now there's about 30 to 35 different organizations in those 3 provinces alone, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Quebec. And the ones where I've been able to access court documents, in particular documents about their origins, is very much, they're very much based in opposition to Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous rights, and are about claiming the same rights that may be granted to Indigenous people. So often hunting, fishing. There's also some sort of land rights organizations, so people who are really into protecting their private property, for instance. Those types of organizations are at the basis of the formation of these Eastern Métis, quote-unquote, organizations, yes.
And you mentioned, there's 30 or more.
Yes.
What's the criteria to become Métis in one of these organizations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've put together a database of these organizations that I've shared widely on social media. And what brings these organizations together in terms of my research and how I'm reading them is they have the same membership policies. And the membership policy is that a person, A, needs to demonstrate that they have an Indigenous ancestor at any point in time, anywhere. But a lot of the organizations have a different level of membership. So the ones that I write about, they have sort of like member B or affiliate member. And all you need to do is sign a sworn statement that you self-identify as Métis. So those are the 2 main criteria that essentially facilitates this movement in many ways. Individuals who have no connection to living Indigenous people, to Indigenous communities, in some cases almost all cases are literally over 300 years away from an Indigenous ancestor, or simply self-identify and/or become members of these organizations.
And, we've looked into some of these as well, and aside from checking a box and sending a photo of yourself off, there's a fee that comes with them.
Yes.
Can you talk about some of those fees? I think you were recently writing some of them are $1,000.
Yeah, so in my research, the organizations that I've looked at, the most that I've encountered is for a first-time member paying $260. But that's without the organization, without using their genealogical service. So if you actually need them to do the genealogy research, that could be several $100s or even a couple $1,000s. I did note that in a recent CBC report that there was mention of some individuals who paid $1,000 for membership cards. And that's part of becoming a member, is you pay a fee and then you pay an annual fee. So the annual fees are in the range usually of about $40 that I've seen in terms of the average. And the first-time fee range from $40 to $260 in terms of what I've found. And that gives you a card which is kind of like an ID card and often resembles a status card. And we know now that are used quite widely in a fraudulent way.
Can you elaborate a little more on the fraudulent way that they are?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so there's been a number of investigations. Apparently there are 3 different government departments right now who are investigating the use of these, and I say Eastern Métis in quotation marks, organizations' cards. So they're used oftentimes for point-of-sale tax rebates in a similar way that in some cases status cards can be used. So latest reports are that they've been used widely in Kahnawake, for instance, in Mohawk territory. But back where I'm from and where I live in Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq communities have been speaking about this now for several months because there's been this ongoing media coverage of it. And they're used widely both on reserve and off reserve as a way to really defraud the system, and also in a way that harms actual Mi'kmaq people who face a lot of opposition to using a status card, for instance, for point-of-sale rebates. So there are quite a few organizations' cards that are being used. Some organizations encourage their members to use them. So they talk about it in their meeting minutes. They go online and defend the practice. Other organizations seem to be surprised or upset even that some of their members are using them. But this is what this whole movement does, right? Is it that it often attracts people who are trying to find a way to oppose Indigenous people. And that's what my research has really demonstrated, is that, like I said, the origins of many of these organizations are in white French descendants being quite upset that they think that Indigenous people have benefits to being Indigenous, right?
And, you know, your research has shown that these Eastern Métis organizations, well, deeply invested, are deeply invested in keeping the status quo while pushing for their own, you know, getting their own indigeneity claims out there. Can you talk a bit about how they actually oppose Indigenous rights?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did research, actually, a kind of a deep dive, if you will, into the two primary organizations in Quebec. And I did that because they're both involved in protracted court battles. So there's hundreds of publicly available court documents that I was able to access. One of the organizations is in Innu territory, so basically on the north shore of the St. Lawrence. And their leaders were leading a movement against an Innu land claim. There were Innu people who were against it for different reasons. But when this land claim was announced, the negotiations, it was a framework agreement in 2000. There was this rise of this anti-Innu, quite racist movement in those regions to oppose the land claim. There was even the foundation of a couple organizations. One of them was called the Association for White Rights, and they, within a year and a half, they had 3,000 members. And, you know, it was quite a violent sort of imagery was being used, and Innu youth were being attacked in schools. And this was kind of well known in the region, but it didn't really get much out of the region. What happens is that the leaders of this movement, after Paoli, they find out about Paoli, they start to identify themselves as Métis. And they go to court in 2006, first to get an injunction against the land claim, saying that they should have been included. That doesn't work, but they file a case saying that they're essentially Métis under Paoli. And it takes many years, but just this past year here, in July 2018, so 12 years later, the Quebec Court of Appeal decided that they're not Métis for the purposes of Paoli, and that they're not Indigenous. So they lost their case, and what happened is, as the case was going on, they encouraged their members to build essentially illegal hunt camps out on Crown land, which is what sort of the case was about originally. And now they've been ordered to take them down. They just appealed for, I think it's called an application for leave to the Supreme Court, where they want the Supreme Court to hear their case. We don't know if that's going to happen. It could. The Supreme Court's probably going to decide in the next month. But that's one organization. So they start as white rights activists, and their members talk about this in interviews that I've accessed through the court case. So they hired an anthropologist who actually lives here in Winnipeg and works here to do interviews with their leadership and some of their members. And the 31 individuals all admit to never identifying as Métis prior to Paoli and prior to their opposition to the Innu. And they also circulate the same types of racist ideas about Indigenous peoples quite openly and regularly. And what was most striking to me in reading through those 31 interviews, it's about 500 pages of transcribed material, is that they openly talk about how they're looking to protect white people and protect white people's rights.
Daryl, unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave you there, but
yeah.
We have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll be right back here on Face to Face to continue our conversation with Daryl LaRue. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Daryl LaRue, a professor in the Department of Social Justice and Community Studies at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And we're discussing the rise of the Eastern Métis. And Daryl, you've written about how there's sinister motives behind the rise to self-identify. Can you talk a bit about those?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think before the break, I was talking about this one organization on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. Another organization that I've done research on quite a bit, actually, and that now has over 20,000 members, is a similar quote-unquote Métis organization in Gaspésie, which is the sort of far eastern region of Quebec that borders New Brunswick. So they're called the Métis Nation of the Rising Sun today. And I've, again, accessed a bunch of court documents, and in the preliminary testimony of two of their founders in federal court, actually, in October 2016, they discussed their origins quite openly. And they start out as a 9-person hunting rights association that are upset that Mi'kmaq community has signed an agreement with the provincial government to set up, which is essentially an outfitting territory. In Quebec, they're called pourvoiries. So the Mi'kmaq would manage this territory. They'd be able to charge a fee to anyone who accesses it. People could go hunting and fishing, trapping, perhaps, but they also wanted to have horseback riding trails and, amenities. And they saw it, the Mi'kmaq did, as an opportunity to, build some of their economic development portfolio, but also to reconnect with parts of their traditional territory that they hadn't been able to for quite a while. So these hunters are in part of that territory, and they're quite upset about this. So they start this movement, along with other hunting rights organizations, hunter and fisher organizations in Gaspésie, to oppose the Mi'kmaq. And what's really interesting is their so-called Grand Chief today is one of the founding members, and he talks about them meeting in a tent during the hunting season in October, where they're moose hunting. And at one of their nightly meetings, one of the other founding members suggests that they likely all have Indigenous ancestry, and the only way to stop this project is to become Aboriginal. So he tells this individual who's a police officer who becomes their Grand Chief today, have you heard about the Pali decision? You need to read it. So he goes back home, reads the Pali decision, and then the next year, when they're when they're out hunting again, they meet in the tent and they decide, we're gonna start a Métis organization. So that's how that Métis organization originates, very explicitly as a way to stop the Mi'kmaq project. And they have some success. The Mi'kmaq project is never signed. It's not only because of the rise of this Métis organization there, but they definitely play an important role in opposing the Mi'kmaq project. And so those are the two organizations that I've studied the most closely, and I have a number of documents. And they both start out in very explicit anti-Indigenous, quite often racist movements, where they're trying to ensure that white folks have access to hunting rights. Yeah.
Daryl, and I want to get into the backlash that you face, but first, as somebody who's yourself not Métis, why is this an issue that you've put so much work into?
Yeah, I mean, my research prior to this specific research, maybe starting this about 3 years ago, has been about the history and contemporary ways in which racism and colonialism get expressed in Quebec, but also in French Canada more generally. I'm a French Canadian, both my parents are. And to me, that was, it's been important to look at how my own people participate in some cases in an ongoing form of colonialism in relation to Indigenous peoples, but also other forms of racism, right? So this project kind of comes out of that. It's just kind of something that came out of my larger research, my larger concerns, also as a French Canadian. And it's something I started, like I said, about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's partly because I started to notice this move in material that I was analyzing, whether it's books or videos or even in the news, where more and more French Canadians in Quebec, but where I'm from in Ontario, and et cetera, started to talk about having Indian blood, or started to actually identify as Indigenous, which to me was something I had to explore if I was going to continue down the route of the research that I've been doing.
We will be talking about the backlash that we'll all receive here for probably doing this show, but I'm just going to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue our conversation here on Face to Face with Daryl LaRue. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest is Daryl Leroux, a professor at St. Mary's University, and we're discussing the rise of the Eastern Métis. And as we've been mentioning, Daryl, you know, you do face a lot of backlash on this, not only online, but can you talk about the type of backlash you get for speaking out on this issue?
But first, I just want to be clear that I see myself as doing research on people like me, who are French descendants, who are white French descendants, who don't have a claim to indigeneity based on, you know, whatever they may be saying in their genealogy. I have some of the same indigenous ancestors in the 1600s as people who are part of this movement, and so do other of my family members, and that doesn't make us indigenous. But I've had family members who've gotten some of these cards.
Right.
So this is also something that I think, as French descendants, we need to speak back to. And some of the backlash, you know, there are obviously people who are going to be upset when you appear to be putting their individual identity claims into question. I tend not to focus too much or much at all on individual claims because I think that's a losing battle. I think that my concern is about the movement overall, and we are talking about tens of thousands of people who are claiming to have indigenous rights who weren't, you know, even just 15 years ago. So there is something happening here that is a social phenomenon. It's something that's larger than just a few individuals, and it is something that we need to be able to explore. You know, we need to be able to explain it and to really try to understand what's pushing people to make these claims. And that's what I'm doing, and that's upsetting to a lot of people, not a lot of people, but some very dedicated people, particularly who lead these new organizations.
But in those efforts, though, you know, they contact your employers, they contact people who fund your research. Is that troubling to you?
Sometimes it can be. It's been about 3.5 years now since I was first contacted on Twitter, actually, by one of the leaders of this movement, and it's been relatively nonstop since then. You know, I just try to go on with my research. I get a lot of support for my research, particularly from individuals who I respect and who have a lot of integrity. And, you know, I think my employer does their due diligence in terms of looking into the complaints, but no one has found any wrongdoing in anything that I've done. Yeah.
Daryl, we only got about a minute here,
yes.
But I did want to mention, you know, in late September, the MOU that was signed between the Métis National Council and the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia expressing their concerns over these claims of Métis identity. Can you just briefly speak, I guess, on the significance of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was quite a breakthrough to have the Métis National Council and the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia to be working together. And that's what the Memorandum of Understanding made clear, that they're going to work together not just in exposing some of the efforts to undermine Métis sovereignty and self-determination, but also to educate the public, right, and to really try to have a broader conversation about who's Indigenous in Nova Scotia and who isn't. And the Acadian Métis simply aren't Indigenous.
Well, Daryl, we appreciate your work and your time being here. And sorry for the comments you'll be receiving on Twitter, I'm sure, afterwards. But we do thank you for joining us today. And that is all the time we have for Face to Face today. We're always looking for new guests, so if you have any suggestions, please email us at news@aptn.ca. This show and past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those at aptn.ca/face-to-face podcast. Thanks for tuning in this week to Face to Face. I'm Dennis Ward. We'll see you next week.